The first ping came back wrong before the Varath fleet had finished decelerating. I was standing at the registry window on the upper tier of Varath Gate when the approach officer read it aloud, voice flat with professional calm. 17 vessels. Transit emergence at 40,000 kilometers, bearing 214, descending into the Yamal approach corridor. Configuration: industrial extraction, or haulers, Borig transports, a small security complement. No warship tonnage in the profile. They weren't expecting resistance. They were expecting a quiet planet. I've worked the Varath Gate for 11 years, ever since I turned the colonel's rank back in and asked for something quieter. There is nothing quiet about Varath Gate. It sits on the western edge of the Yamal corridor, where the approach lane cuts between Vethra Station and the outer warship berths, and on any given morning you can watch 16 kilometers of human hull drift past the observation panel at low altitude, close enough to read the hull markings without magnification. I have never stopped finding it remarkable. Most mornings I don't let myself stare. That morning, I stared. The second ping was already compiling when the Varath fleet's lead vessel broadcast its first communication. The message came in on the Galactic Commercial Band, old format, properly filed, translated automatically by the Gates registry system. It identified the sender as the Varath Yield Consortium, holder of Survey Grant Varath 7 through Varath 19, registered under the Galactic Mineral Rights Accord, Epoch Classification Pre-cession. It stated that the consortium was arriving to commence extraction operations on its registered claim sites in the Yamal, Lena, and Katanga basin corridors. It requested landing clearance and surface access at the claim coordinates. The approach officer looked at me. I was the senior civilian liaison on deck. She didn't need to say anything. We both understood what a pre-cession epoch classification meant in practical terms. It meant the survey was 22,000 years old. I keyed my line to the gate registry and asked for the Varath file. The system pulled it in under a second. I already knew what was in it. I had read it years ago, when I first took the posting, because every senior liaison at Varath Gate reads the Varath file on their first week. It is part of the orientation. Not because it is likely to be needed. Because it is a reminder of what Earth remembers, and what Earth has already done with what it remembers. The Varath survey team had arrived 22,400 years ago. They were professional, methodical, and thorough. They seeded the approach corridor with survey beacons on a 200-kilometer grid, mapped every significant lithium-cobalt seam from surface to 3,000-meter depth, catalogued the rare earth concentrations in the northern basin systems, and filed a complete mineralogical record under a standard pre-cession extraction grant. Then they left. We found their first beacon 340 years after they departed. It took our engineers another 60 years to decode the survey encoding and another 20 to cross-reference the mineral manifest against our own geological records. The match was exact. Every seam they had mapped was still there, still untouched, exactly as their instruments had recorded it. We read the grant filing carefully. We understood what it meant. We also understood that no enforcement mechanism existed at Earth, that the filing authority that had registered the grant was 140 light-years away and showed no interest in our system, and that the materials on the Varath manifest were precisely the materials our engineers needed to build the next generation of orbital defense platforms. The first extraction crew went into the Yamal Basin 480 years after the Varath had left. Not scrappy, not desperate, planned. We knew what we were pulling and why. The Lena Basin followed 2 centuries later. The Katanga series was last, completed across a span of 400 years, because those seams ran deep and required a boring technology we hadn't finished developing yet. When it was done, the Varath manifest was empty. Every catalogued gram had been accounted for. Our own engineers were meticulous about this. They cross-referenced the Varath survey line by line, pulled each entry to depletion, and logged the final disposition of every extracted ton. Where it went. What it became. The registry is not a boast. It is a ledger. I pulled that ledger up now on the gate display, alongside the Varath communication, and began reading the first transmission back. On behalf of Varath Gate Surface Station, Earth Planetary Entry Authority, I acknowledged the Varath Yield Consortium's arrival and confirmed receipt of their extraction request. I informed them that the Varath survey grant was on file and had been reviewed. I informed them that before landing clearance could be issued, the consortium was required under Earth Entry Protocol 7 to receive and sign the pre-existing claim reconciliation document, which I was transmitting now. The reconciliation document was 340 pages long. It was also, as I told the approach officer quietly while we waited for the response, the most thorough piece of administrative work in the Gates history. The Reconciliation Office had prepared it over the course of 6 years, updated and re-verified every decade since, and it listed, for every entry in the original Varath survey manifest, 3 data columns: the mineral quantity catalogued, the extraction date range, and the final designation of the extracted material. Hull alloy class, platform superstructure grade, drive shielding compound, battery array substrate. There was 1 column for each of the Varath's 1,847 individual survey entries. Not 1 entry read unaccounted. Not 1 entry read lost. Not 1 entry was missing a final designation. I set the document transmitting and stepped back from the console. The approach officer was watching the fleet's position on the corridor display. 17 contacts burning cold and still at 40,000 kilometers. They were not running. They were reading. The Varath fleet held position for 4 hours before the lead vessel responded. When it did, the message was not on the commercial band. It was on the diplomatic frequency. The voice that came through was not a translation. It was a senior factor, what the consortium called its lead negotiator, speaking through their own translation layer in careful, precise Standard Galactic. He said the consortium had reviewed the document. He said there appeared to have been a significant administrative discrepancy. He said the consortium wished to clarify the status of its registered claim sites before making any further transmissions. I told him there was no discrepancy. I told him that the reconciliation document was accurate to within 1 metric ton across all 1,847 claim entries, and that the margin of error was attributable to trace particulate loss during extraction processing and was itself accounted for in the methodology annex on page 312. There was a silence on the line that lasted long enough that the approach officer leaned over to check whether the channel was still open. Then the factor asked, with careful precision, whether I was telling him that the surveyed materials had been removed from the registered claim sites. I said yes. He asked when. I said the extraction operations had been conducted in phases over approximately 19,000 years, beginning approximately 480 years after the consortium's survey team departed. I said the final depletion was logged 3,200 years ago. He asked what the materials had been used for. I told him I would transmit page 1 of the reconciliation document, which contained the summary table. I asked him to look at column 3. He said, after a moment, that column 3 appeared to list ship classifications. I said yes. I said that 34% of the surveyed material had been allocated to the first 3 generations of Earth orbital defense platforms, now decommissioned. I said that 41% had been allocated to warship construction across 11 hull generations, the most recent of which was currently represented in the approach corridor by the carrier group he could likely observe from his sensors. I said that the remaining 25% had been distributed across megastructure superframes, drive system shielding, and weapons platform substrate, the relevant installations being visible from his current position if his sensor suite was calibrated for ground surface megastructure at ranges below 500 kilometers. He was quiet for a long time. Outside the observation panel, the morning shift at Vethra Station was moving a new hull section into the upper berth cradle, a forward section of what would eventually be the 31st carrier in the Andarath class, still raw and open-framed at this stage, enormous even half-built. I watched the tug arms position it. I thought about the men and women who had worked those Yamal seams in the first centuries. Hard ground, cold seasons, long shifts. They had not known what the material would eventually become. They had known that it needed to come out of the ground, and they had known why, and they had done the work. The factor came back on the line and said the consortium wished to raise the question of compensation. I had been waiting for that. I told him the Reconciliation Office had anticipated the question and had prepared a counter-submission, which I was now transmitting. I told him the counter-submission was titled Earth Mineral Extraction Against Outstanding Varath Abandonment Covenant Liabilities, Epoch Classification Pre-cession, and that it ran to 714 pages. I told him that the Abandonment Covenant, a standard clause in pre-cession survey grants, binding on the granting authority in the event of a failure to maintain contact with a surveyed inhabited world for a period exceeding 500 years, had triggered 21,400 years ago. I told him that Earth had identified the covenant clause in the original grant filing, had filed a formal abandonment notice with the Galactic Registry at that time, had received no response, had refiled at 500-year intervals for the following 18,000 years, and had accumulated the full record of non-response in Appendix 4, which began on page 389. I told him that the counter-submission calculated the covenant liability at a figure his translation layer would render as substantial. I told him the methodology was on page 12. I told him we were not, at this time, demanding settlement. I told him we were presenting the liability for the consortium's records so that the question of compensation could be considered in its full context. He did not respond immediately. I poured myself a cup of coffee from the station pot and stood at the observation panel and watched the Yamal morning come in over the eastern ridge, the sky pale and cold and very clear, the warship berth strung along the horizon like a line of standing stones. When the factor came back, he said the consortium would need to consult with its legal division. I said that was entirely reasonable and that Varath Gate would hold the approach corridor available for the consortium's fleet at no charge for a period of 72 hours, after which standard corridor occupancy fees would apply. He said he understood. I said there was one more item, which I wished to transmit as a courtesy rather than as a formal submission. I said it was a single page, the first page of the original Varath survey grant Varath 7, as filed by the consortium's own survey team 22,400 years ago. I said I thought the factor might find it useful context. The first page of the original grant was a standard boilerplate pre-cession form. It listed the survey team, the grant coordinates, the mineral classifications, the filing date, and, at the bottom, the standard pre-cession expectation clause. Asterisk survey site is assessed as pre-industrial. Indigenous population is assessed as non-space capable. Extraction access is expected to remain uncontested upon return. Asterisk. I let him sit with that for a moment. Then I told him that Varath Gate would keep the channel open, and that I hope his legal division worked quickly, and that if his crew required any supply resupplied during the consultation period, Earth provided standard commercial docking to visiting non-hostile vessels at Vethra Station, 3rd Ring, and I could forward the tariff schedule if that would be useful. He said no. He said they had sufficient supply. He said, carefully, that the consortium had not anticipated this situation. I said that I understood, and that I did not imagine they had. The Varath fleet began its withdrawal burn 31 hours later, well inside the 72-hour window. The factor sent a final formal transmission acknowledging receipt of all documents and stating the consortium would respond to the counter-submission through proper galactic legal channels. I logged it, appended it to the Varath file, and noted the closure of the active contact period. Then I pulled up the first page of the original survey grant one more time, the one I'd transmitted to the factor, and I read the bottom line again. Asterisk pre-industrial. Non-space capable. Uncontested. Asterisk. I thought about the men and women in the Yamal seams. I thought about the engineers who had decoded the survey beacons, who had made the decision about what to do with what they found. I thought about the generation that had built the first platform with that material, and the generation after them, and the one after that, 21,000 years of people who had kept the ledger current, who had refiled the abandonment notice every 5 centuries because the Covenant required it and because Earth does not let a record lapse. I closed the Varath file. I sent the closure notification to the Reconciliation Office. I wrote up my shift log, 3 paragraphs, factual. Then I refilled my coffee and watched the whole section settle into the cradle, and the tug arms withdraw, and the morning shift begin their first inspection walk along the new frame. The work was the same as it had always been. It was just larger now.